listening to the best of the Martha Zoller Show. To hear the full show each day, tune in to AM 550 and FM 102.9 WDUN or log in to accesswdun.com and click the Listen Live button from 9 to 11, Monday through Friday. It is my pleasure to bring Ned Ryun here. His new book is American Levaithon, if you can say that. It's great. Government takeover, the growing regime, and turning America into. Gosh, it is so great to talk to you, Ned. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, and so tell us a little bit about American Levaithon, because that's a big word, you know, but it fits what you're talking about in this book.
It really does. I mean, obviously, I think when people hear the word Leviathan, they think of the sea monster out of the Old Testament.
Yes.
But the second definition is actually a political state, a totalitarian one with a vast, sprawling bureaucracy, which is exactly what we have in Washington, D.C. today with the administrative state. And, Martha, the point I make in the book, it details the rise of the progressive movement, their rejection of the Constitution. They've been seeking to undermine the political and moral authority of that document since the very beginning, which, by the way, today is Constitution Day, celebration of the greatest political document the world has seen. And in place of our constitutional republic, progressives wanted to place an administrative state, vast bureaucracy filled with an unelected, so-called educated elite managerial class that would do the actual governing. And, Martha, I make the point in the book, the only separation of powers that the progressives were interested in was separating out the administrative state from any political accountability from our duly elected representatives or from the American people themselves.
And tell me what you think about this, because I've been observing, you know, kind of what's happened in the Democratic Party, where for the last three elections, and they've done it for a long. I mean, one thing about progressives is, you know, they waited 100 years for health care change. They will stick with their ideas and they never give up. There's no doubt about that. But the last three elections, there's been a manipulation, is the nice word, of delegates to get a different result of who the voters would have put in as the primary, 2016, 2020, and now the most extreme example where the voters had actually voted in all the primaries and then they changed it up. I think that's a part of all this, because the question is very easily raised. Who's running the country right now? It's not Joe Biden. Who is it?
Correct. Well, the whole point with progressives is that these unelected bureaucrats would do the actual governing and managing of the country. So I don't think it should be a surprise. I think it's a bit startling to a lot of the American people that haven't been paying attention that a president can be AWOL, but somehow the government keeps going. Well, that was the whole point of the progressives 100 years ago. And they felt like that's where they wanted to be. So
when Woodrow Wilson's wife took care of everything while he was sick.
100%. Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, Herbert Crowley, Robert La Follette, all of these, I call them the four horsemen of the progressive apocalypse. They were far more interested in having this managerial class do the governing. But back to your point regarding these Democratic primaries. The least democratic body in the United States today is the Democratic Party. They're not interested in representative democracy, because that's in line with progressives. They want to manipulate anything and everything to get their way. In fact, they're not really interested in representative democracy writ large, because they think it's a dirty, messy process. They don't think that, and Martha, I know some people will find this startling for me to say this, they're not really interested in elections having consequences. And by that I mean elections come and go, administrations come and go, and the administrative state remains. And I think that's a serious problem for the American people in regards to, if you have no recourse for grievances against those who are actually governing the country, because remember, this administrative state is separated out from accountability, what does that actually look like? And that's why the second part, the subtitle of the book, The Birth of the Administrative State and Progressive Authoritarianism, you get to the point where people are being dictated to by those who are actually governing the country. And that's not actually has anything to do with the original intent of our constitutional republic or representative democracy.
And it is Constitution Day. We're talking to Ned Ryun, who is the grassroots and conservative activist. He's the founder and CEO of American Majority. He's also the writer of the book American Levaithon. And you make a pretty shocking statement in this book where you say that too many people think we're still a constitutional republic, but we're not.
We're not. No. So, again, the progressives rejected wholesale the moral and political legitimacy of the Constitution, but they also went after and made, I would argue, a slow regime change against the machinery of the republic. What do I mean by that? Separation of powers. Progressives hated that idea. They hated the idea that somehow this diffusion of power was what should exist, which, Martha, I make the point in my first book, Restoring Our Republic. The machinery of the republic and diffusion of power is the greatest protector of our natural inherent rights. It's not a Bill of Rights, which is very nice, but it's the machinery of the republic. Why? Because when power is diffused, it cannot be used to abuse rights. Progressives hated that because they felt that it limited progress. So they wanted to consolidate all the powers, executive, legislative, judicial, into one body, the administrative state, which primarily resides inside the executive branch, Article 2 branch of our constitutional government, and then put all those powers into those unelected bureaucrats to do the governing, because progressives are convinced that the state is salvation. Therefore, if the state is salvation, you should never limit the state. You should never limit where the state goes. It should go into every aspect of life, every aspect of business, and the state should be continued to be funded. That's why we're, $36 trillion in debt with no end in sight. But if the state is salvation, why would you ever want to limit salvation? That's how progressives think.
So when did it change? I mean, because you look at
1912.
1912. I mean, so even you think John F. Kennedy was a part of this?
So I chronicle in the book, 1912 presidential election was a massive pivot point in our history because progressives won. Woodrow Wilson took the White House. He began the administrative state during his 2 terms, although, as you alluded to earlier, second term he wasn't really in charge. And then it began in the first. That's the first wave of progressivism.
And I've written about the fact I think 1913 was one of the 2 worst years in American history. Yep. 1913 because of the income tax and then the direct election of senators. And then 1966 when Lyndon Johnson mixed all the Medicare and Social Security money in with the general budget.
So you're tying into 2 themes. 1913, why did they start the IRS and the income tax? Because if the state is salvation, the state must be funded.
Right.
And tariffs weren't cutting it for them. So that first wave, the second wave was FDR and the New Deal. And the third massive sledgehammer that you just mentioned was LBJ and his great society and how he was going to use government. The whole point of progressives is that they think the state can be used with the managerial class to shape this country into the vision of their own making. And along the way, there have been presidents that have not really fully bought into it. I would argue the last 2 presidents before Trump that said we reject the premise that this is legitimate, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. Every president since then, including George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, accepted the premise that somehow the administrative state was legitimate and should remain. Donald Trump shows up, and this is kind of the thing that startled me into wanting to write this book, Martha. When Donald J. Trump showed up in January of 2017, he essentially said, I'm the duly elected president of the United States. I'm the one who decides both foreign and domestic policy. And permanent D.C., the administrative state, and its allies said, we don't think so. We think we're the ones that decide. So if people want to know what all this crazy Russian collusion hoax and Ukrainian quid pro quo and every other thing that's been thrown against Donald Trump is all about, it's about who decides. And in a republic, it's the duly elected representatives. And in an administrative state, it's the managerial class. 2 very different governing philosophies that will never mix oil and water. And it took the great outsider, Donald J. Trump, showing up in D.C. to really bring this to the surface. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, to provide clarity to the American people. This is what is actually happening.
So give me some hope, Ned, because I feel really bad right now.
The last chapter. I mean, Donald Trump has to win. Again, the administrative state is in the second Article 2 branch of our government, which is run by the president. And if a powerful executive comes in and decides I'm done with the administrative state for 4 years through a series of executive orders and reform items, that president, Donald J. Trump, can break apart and devolve the administrative state. And so I put in the last chapter a whole series of reform items that even if Congress doesn't want to step up to the plate, we can kind of bank on them being feckless and lacking political courage. A powerful executive can actually start to break apart the administrative state. And so that last chapter in my book gives me hope. The other thing that gives me hope, Martha, really quick, is Supreme Court decisions this summer. They overturned Chevron deference. They said judges no longer defer to the unelected bureaucrats' decisions. And then, two, the SEC tribunal decision in which the Supreme Court said, Securities and Exchange Commission, you can't have your private administrative law tribunals anymore. First of all, undermines an independent judiciary. And two, it annihilates the Seventh Amendment right to trial by jury. So you're seeing Supreme Court stepping up to the plate. You get a powerful executive in doing these reform items. And then, quite frankly, Martha, again, the reason I wrote the book is that the American people would fully understand what's going on and say we reject the legitimacy on any level of the administrative state. It's unconstitutional. Quite frankly, it's un-American. So I'd encourage people to go to Amazon.com or Books A Million or Barnes & Noble. Grab a copy today. It is out. Read it. You'll be illuminated.
Ned Ryun, American Levaithon, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks, Martha.
It's where North Georgia comes to talk. It's the Martha Zoller Show on AM 550 and FM 102.9 WDUN.
When we go to audience questions, the first or second question is about election security. So the bill tonight would have accomplished both those objectives. We would have funded the government and secured the election.
It is the Martha Zoller Show. We're here with Representative Andrew Clyde. That was Mike Johnson talking about the failed budget bill that happened last night. So, Andrew, I guess we need an update from you on where we are right now related to the budget.
Well, good morning, Martha.
Good morning. Sorry to get right into it, but you know how it is.
No, that's fine. Speaker Johnson was exactly correct. You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take, and we took the shot yesterday. I really hope that had hoped that we'd get all the Republicans on board and that we would pass that, because as the Speaker just said, it would have done great things to protect our election integrity and ensuring that, or going a long way to ensure that non-citizens are stripped from the voting rolls, and we would have pushed the continuing resolution we'd have pushed FY25 funding into Republican territory, where we'd potentially have a Republican House, Senate, and presidency. So therefore, we could craft the fiscal year 25 appropriations with Republican priorities and Republican spending levels, and that's why it was a good idea to do. And I voted for it. That's why I voted for it, Martha. But right now, it failed. So they're going to have to go back. We'll find out a little bit later today exactly what the plan is. But I'm hoping that we don't end up having to take what the Senate sends our way, because I'm not going to vote for a continuing resolution that leads us into a December omnibus. That's just doing what we've always done before, and we're always going to get the same result.
Yeah, I tell you what, maybe one day we'll have you back in here and have a long discussion about how the primary system has just kind of driven candidates to the right and the left, and they don't get anything done. And I think we've got to figure out a way to, one, tell the truth to the American people about what's actually happening, and I think you do that. But you also have to be honest. We have to allow people like you to come forward and say, you know what, this part I don't like, this part I do like, but on balance, here's what I'm going to do. And you shouldn't have to pay a price for that. You should be doing what the truthful nature is of it. But right now, we've created a world, Andrew, where people don't allow politicians to make mistakes. And if you don't allow somebody to admit their mistakes, then they just start lying.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've experienced up here a lot is people lying. People aren't telling the truth. They try and conceal ideas or conceal the real, what's written in a bill so that somebody will vote for it and not knowing what they're voting for. But now that's not the way I operate.
That's right. Well, listen, you and I could commiserate about that. Anyway, there's also a bill related to AM radio, which is, of course, very close to my heart. But also, I think it's a national security situation because, we just saw what happened over in Israel where they used pagers over in Lebanon where they used pagers and walkie-talkies, that you could get into a situation where communications are compromised. But if AM radio is not available, we could be stuck.
Well, that's why it's so important. You have the emergency broadcast system, which goes out on AM radio and it has such extensive reach. And people's emergency radios are AM, their radios in their vehicles are AM, and need to stay AM. And the reason for that is simply for no other reason but this emergency broadcast system that we have put so much time and effort and resources in this country as a way to notify people, whether it's, extreme weather or whatever emergency there is, so that people have a way of knowing what's going on, because it is so critical that people stay informed for their personal safety and the safety of their families.
I mean, and it's 4 times. Look, I love being on AM radio, and I love the fact we're AM and FM, and we bring a great product out there. But at a time of a crisis, say power's out, or there's an electronic pulse that knocks everything out, whatever it is, that if you've got a battery-powered AM radio or you've got AM radio in your vehicle, you're going to be able to still know what's happening in the world.
That's exactly correct, and that's why that particular bill is so important. It got marked up in Energy and Commerce, so looking forward to it coming to the House floor. Don't have a schedule on that yet, but it is moving, and that's good news.
Now, I do know that I ask you this question every time we get together, and it's one of those things that just weighs on my mind, is that I think we're going to have a good November election. I think we'll win the presidency. I think we're going to win the Senate, and I think we can keep the House. It's going to be a little trickier to keep the House, but I think we can keep the House. But we will have what we need to do to get things done. In my lifetime, have helped Republicans get elected and to take power of all the branches of the federal government. This will be the 3rd time in my lifetime. And none of the times they keep their promises about things like budgeting and taxes and spending and all of that. Why will this time be different? Why should a voter out there that's trying to make their mind up about what to do, why should they give the power to Republicans?
Well, I think that, number one, you've got different members here. I think you have a much stronger conservative base than we've ever had before. And those conservatives are committed to doing what they have said. Like, I'm committed to doing what I have said that I'm going to do. We are going to push for a balanced budget amendment. I mean, that was one of the critical things of the speaker battle back in January of 23. We have got to get our financial house in order. Otherwise, this country is going on the path of financial ruin. Our debt, our current $35 trillion debt is the greatest threat, the greatest domestic threat we have right now in this country. And if we don't get it in, put our house in order financially, then we are going to see a significant problem in our future. And we've got to do that, Martha. It's imperative that we do that.
Well, I tell you what, I don't always like the ideas that Rand Paul has, but his idea of going back to the 2019 budget, which was $1 trillion deficit, by the way, okay, going back to the 2019 budget, adjusting it for inflation, that brings you up to about 5.5 trillion. I think that's still roughly $100 billion in deficit, but that is a rounding error compared to where we are right now. And I think it makes a lot of sense. It gets all the COVID money out of there, and it gives us a fresh start. I don't know if he's going to get any traction there, but I think it makes sense.
Well, it does make sense. I mean, you could actually grow the economy with a president like President Trump at the helm. We could grow the economy to overcome that kind of a deficit. But right now you're looking at a 2.3 to 2.5, and I've even seen as high as, depending upon the days that you look at, go back 365 days, a $3 trillion deficit. That is completely unsustainable, Martha. You can't do that and have a viable country for very long.
No, you're absolutely right about that. So what's on your plate that you're working on now between the end of the year that we haven't talked about?
Well, I will tell you that we've got a continuing resolution, a Congressional Review Act that is in the Judiciary Committee actually this morning that's being marked up by Chairman Jordan, and that will strike down an ATF rule that came out about a few months ago, and that redefines what a federal farms licensee is, and that's basically the ATF legislating, creating new law, which they're not allowed to do, that they're not of the legislative body. So that rule should be marked up today and hopefully will come to the floor. We've been pretty successful in taking down the Biden administration rules, and we're going to continue to do that. And then hopefully in January, when we have a Republican president, then all of the other rules that the Biden administration, and that's across the board when it comes to the various different agencies, whether it's the EPA or whether it's the Education Department, with their rule about ensuring that that males can participate in female sports, which is completely wrong. We're going to take those rules out too, and I'm looking forward to it.
Putting the talk in news talk. It's the Martha Zoller Show on AM 550 and FM 102.9 WDUN.
We're talking to Brent Buchanan from Cygnal about a poll that came out after the Appalachia shooting that his company did. And, of course, as you know, Appalachia High School is in our listening area. And happily, they are back in band competitions, and it looks like they may be back to school next week, as well as trying to get back to some kind of normalcy in the life that they have as a school. Brent, thank you so much for being with me today.
Hey, thank you, Martha.
So what made you decide to poll this, number one? And then number two, what were the basic findings?
Yeah, it's always tough after a tragedy like this to separate the consequence of what happened from how do we solve this at the source so it doesn't happen again. And so that was one of the main driving factors of doing this is with the legislative session coming up in a few months, what can elected officials do? What do parents want elected officials to do to address the root causes that lead to tragedies like this?
So what did you find? What were the things that stuck out to you the most?
Well, the biggest was that parents very much want it to start with consequences for even a threat. Because this particular case, this is not the first time that the young man had said anything about this. The FBI had been looking into it for over a year, and 88% of folks said that students who threaten to shoot up a school, quote, shoot up a school, should face consequences. They should be expelled, arrested, maybe even a third of voters said involuntarily commit them to a mental institution. And then even just those threats being made, the same number of parents believe that administrators, principals, and teachers should be informed that a threat was even made. And that 83% of parents want themselves to be informed by the school when a threat is made against the school. And they want to see consequences on the parents who enable or allow this too, like was done in the case of the shooting there in Georgia, the father. So there's just, I don't do a whole lot of polls where 70 or 80%, upwards of 90% of people agree on anything. We don't really live in a world of 80, 90% agreement anymore. But the parents in Georgia are very much in lockstep on wanting to see this addressed at the time a threat is made, not just after a tragedy happens.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And there is, I think what's such a challenge is that I was talking to a Democratic state legislator yesterday, and I made the point to her, I said, even if everything you've proposed had been in place, in this particular case, the parent wouldn't have risen to the level that they would have had no guns. They may have been a bad parent. They may have been, but they hadn't risen to the level of a criminal record where they would have had no guns. And a 14-year-old shouldn't have access to guns, period. So, there is that challenge of, even if you put laws in place, if there's family breakdown, which clearly there was in this case, how do you deal with that? And that's why I think the informational part that showed up so prominently in your poll, the parents just want to know. I think the biggest shock of this whole thing was that the FBI had interviewed this guy a year ago. And why wasn't some kind of help? And it does seem like his other parent that was not living in the home was trying to get help for this young man. I mean, there were just a lot of breakdowns in this case.
Well, and we even asked voters if they think this stems from not this particular case, but just school shootings in general. They stem from a lack of mental resources or firearms to blame. And only a third of parents in Georgia said firearms are to blame, and over half said it's lack of mental health resources.
Yes.
I think you're spot on. And what is the root cause of this? It's not that there's a threat; it's that there's something that led up to that threat. And so when we said, well, what solutions would you support? 71% of parents said increasing mental health services, 69% consequences for threatening students, like we were talking about, 65% training school resource officers, another 65% controlling access points. So there are things to do at the different steps of what leads to a tragedy like this. But the overwhelming response from Georgia parents is, don't just do something, do a lot and address each of the steps.
Yeah, I mean, we have in our school system here in Hall County, where I'm based out of, for the last couple of years, they've been doing a training for not only students for anger management kind of things, but all the way up to the janitor, to the employee, anybody in the school system. And they have been able to drastically reduce conflict between people in the school system since they've been doing this program, because as the superintendent says, is that we know who these school shooters are. These school shooters are a student, a faculty member, a relative. There's somebody that has interacted with the school in some way. They're not just somebody walking in off the street that has no connection to the school. And that's why I think you're seeing in this poll, and what I found so interesting in this poll, is this kind of multi-pronged approach that parents want.
Definitely. Well, we could talk about societal problems that have led up to it too, but I didn't cover that in the poll.
No, I know you didn't. And as you mentioned in your bio, you have no free time because you have 5 children. So
I do, and they go to public school.
Yeah, absolutely. So listen, do you think this is an issue that will have legs in a few weeks as people go to vote, or do you think this is more of an issue that people will think about in their own local communities?
Voters are a lot smarter than I think pundits and some politicians give them credit for. And, we saw this when I was the pollster for Governor Kemp in his election. Like they realize who can address crime, who can address inflation, who can address school safety, who can address violence, who can address name the issue. And I don't think you're going to see anything at the federal level of an impact from this. But I do think you're going to see some pressure from voters saying to state legislative candidates, like, you got to do something about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit, and I hope I'm not coming out of left field here, is that, of course, we have a presidential election in, 48 days, whatever the number of days is. And it's something like, I think we've had 10 years of political news in the last 3 months. And, and I always say to my friends, if you say you know what's going to happen, you don't. I mean, it's a very fluid kind of situation. But as far as Kamala Harris goes, 3-4 months ago, the New York Times was saying how hard she was to work for, and she was a drag on the ticket, and, all of this kind of stuff. And then there's been this transformation that, like, I've never seen before, of a candidate now becoming popular. But when you dig into the polling that I've seen, she's not doing as well as Joe Biden and many of the core groups that Democrats need to win. And then, President Trump, of course, has had this 2 assassination attempts, and I think he had a very good rally yesterday, and he did a very calm kind of presentation there. But what are your thoughts, and what is the polling you're doing showing kind of where we are today as far as the presidential race goes?
Well, the AJC poll that came out, what was that, yesterday, I think is pretty spot on in the challenge that Kamala Harris has in flipping the Sunbelt states. There was a poll maybe a week or two ago that came out in Arizona from a friend of mine, a very respected polling firm. And if you look at some of the key demographics in that poll, like younger voters, voters of color, she definitely fixed some of the issues that Biden had with those voters. But I'll give you two numbers that really stuck out to me. In 2020 in Arizona, Biden won younger voters by 33 points over Trump. And in my friend's poll, she was only winning those voters by 11 points. So you can start to see a delta among some key groups that she definitely did better than Biden with, but she's not doing well enough to say win Arizona as an example. And then if we swap over to Pennsylvania, which I think is the linchpin of the election, the Teamsters yesterday released data that their membership when Biden was the candidate, that he was the preferred candidate of the Teamsters members, 12 million strong union. And then when they surveyed between Harris and Trump was up over 30 points, almost 30 points among the membership on Harris. And so I think that's indicative of this white working class voter in these Midwestern Rust Belt type states that Biden actually would have done better with than she has. Now, has she invigorated younger voters and voters of color in Philadelphia? Yes, 100%. But there's more white working class voters in Pennsylvania. It's the whitest working class state in the country. And so I think she has some inherent challenges that Teamster data kind of bears out.
Well, I tell you, it's so interesting, but I still am of the mind that this is Trump's election to lose. I think that the economy is the biggest issue, as well as immigration, and I just really want people. I want whatever the result to be, for it to be a result of a lot of people going out to vote, and there being confidence in what the result is. And so that's what I'm looking for.
I agree. And it does. A very close election is not good for America in where we find ourselves right now.
I appreciate it very much. If people want to know more about the work you're doing, how can they find out?
Well, hop online and go to Cygnal. That's cygn.al. So it's our company name with just a dot between the N and the AL. And we've got national poll. We just released a congressional battleground poll this week, looking at the top 39 congressional seats, and we'll be in the field in a couple of weeks with another national poll for folks.
Absolutely. Brent Buchanan, thank you so much for being with me today.
Hey, my pleasure.
To hear the full versions of last week's Martha Zoller shows, go to the podcast page at accesswdun.com, and you can follow me on social media at Martha Zoller.